let us look at the state of panchayats after 2 decades after the institution of panchayats. In 1992, two significant reforms were initiated in independent India. One being the economic reforms, popularly called as the LPG reforms, or the liberalization, privatization and the globalization of Indian economy, and the other being the institutional reforms of Panchayat Raj. So, in the past 2 decades, have we met the letter and spirit of the constitution? If not, what is the way ahead? I think it is important for us to stop and take a deep look at how we should start. We should start about looking at this whole issue of Panchayat Raj institutions for various reasons. We can clearly understand that the Panchayat Raj reforms initiated have two primary facets, one being the mandatory provisions which must be implemented by the state governments, and the other being the voluntary provisions which may be implemented by the state governments. The mandatory provisions include that of elections every 5 years, elections to the Panchayat Raj institutions at all the 3 tiers every 5 years. For that you need an independent election commission which must be constituted by the state government, and there is an issue of fiscal devolution for which a state finance commission must be in place. Apart from this, if district has to be the focus or the center, the epicenter of planning, then there must be a district planning committee which takes into consideration both the rural and urban aspects. So these mandatory aspects, it must be gainsaid that they have been successfully accomplished. Now look at the figures. We have some stunning and staggering figures. The total number of panchayats at the grassroots level are 2.5 lakh PRA institutions, and the total number of elected members are 32 lakh. And in that the number of women are 12 lakh. Thereby we can safely conclude that elections have by and large been a successful accomplishment across the states. Now this is a significant political empowerment. To use the words of Prime Minister, I quote, this is an achievement in political empowerment that in scale and numbers is without precedent in history and parallel in world. Okay, there is a silent revolution that is taking place in our countryside. Silent only because the media and the urban political opinion are not giving adequate attention to it. It is the harbinger of a new hope for eradication of rural poverty and the promotion of rural prosperity. Unquote. Now this is the Prime Minister of India talking to the nation in 2006. So in essence we can say that grassroots political empowerment, by deepening the democracy, by bringing more groups into the corridors of power, has been a successful accomplishment of independent India, and it is by no means a mean achievement, right? As one commentator put it, the total number of women representatives in India are higher than the rest of the world put together. But there is another darker side to this. The other darker side being that now that we have the institutions in place, now what did these institutions do? Do we have the enough means and requisite potential to make them operate in the way they should operate? So which means that what is the core of this institution? Are the institutions an end in themselves, or do we need the institutions to do the functions we need them to do? So which means that Article 243G of the Constitution, which uses the word local government, that is the Panchayat Raj, as a self-government. So it is Article 253G of the Constitution, passed in 1992, which emphatically establishes the fact that Panchayat Raj institutions are self-governing institutions, which means they are autonomous, they are independent, and they are accountable to the people. But what is the real picture? By and large, the conclusion is that the operative core, quote-unquote operative core, which is the real stuff of the institution called Panchayat Raj, which is in the part 9 of the Constitution, talks about the devolution of the 3 Fs, which is nothing but the funds, the functions and the functionaries. we can safely conclude that the operative core of Part 9 is far from in accord with the letter and spirit of the constitutional amendments. There is enough proof which is documented in the literature. For example, the devolution index which is constructed by Indian Institute of Public Administration says that the devolution index for 2012-13, it says that the national average for devolution is 35%, which means that only 35% of the required things are done and the rest of the things are not at all achieved, which means 2 decades later still we are going at a snail pace. That is one. But then this national average blinds many of the interstate variations, in the sense that, see, look at the interstate variation. We have Chandigarh which has devolved as less as 18%. On the other hand, you have Maharashtra which has devolved 65%. Well, 65% is definitely less, but then it is more than what Chandigarh has devolved. So there is huge interstate variation and there is huge intrastate variation. So within the state, the devolution functions have not worked equally well. In some, it can be said that the devolution has not followed pace with the mandatory provisions. So now you have the institutions. Apart from the devolution index, which is an aggregate sum of 6 important factors like functions, functionaries, finances, capacity building, training, accountability and transparency, you have a separate index within the devolution index for devolution of functions, devolution of functionaries, devolution of finances. Now we understand that, following the tradition of Kautilya, devolution of finances is very important because the strength of the economy, the strength of the country lies not in its army but in the size of its revenue. So devolution of finances indicated that devolution of finances is only 30%, okay, and it is least. It is the least of functions and functionaries, whereas functions is around 35% and functionaries is also around 35%, but devolution of finances is just less than 30%, which means that the local government institutions, which is the Panchayat Raj institutions, are not at all self-government institutions because they are still dependent on higher types, or rather the upper types of governance. Now that is a fundamental problem. It can be easily summed up as the shell of the Panchayat Raj institution is in place. Filling the shell has not followed any consistent pattern either within the states or between the states. Now, having said that, we must understand that this lack of adequate filling of the shell has created certain crucial distortions in the way Panchayat Raj institutions have been understood and have been functioning. Now this half-baked and half-hearted nature of reform of Panchayat Raj institutions since 1992, for the last 2 decades, have resulted in 4 key distortions. The first and foremost distortion is that there is an absence of collegiate functioning. Now what do we mean by collegiate functioning? I repeat, there is an absence of collegiate functioning. Collegiate functioning means that a collegiate functioning is nothing but literally it is a shared responsibility. Now here is a case wherein the constitution says that the Gram Sabha is at the very base of the entire Panchayat Raj system. Now Gram Sabha is like a parliament. It's akin to the parliament which is at the center and the state legislature which is at the state capital. Now the Gram Sabha should function, should deliberate, should discuss issues, and finally it will decide that okay, so and so action should be taken. Now who will take the action? It is the Sarpanch who takes the action. Now the Sarpanch is assisted by an UPSarpanch or a vice president. There will be a functionary which is the bureaucrat called the secretary to the Panchayat. He will be assisting the Sarpanch and the UPSarpanch in carrying out their own functions. Now what if the Gram Sabha does not take a decision and Sarpanch alone takes the decision? That is not what is certainly envisaged in the constitution, because the constitution in itself gives a high degree of primacy to the Gram Sabha. For the first time in independent India, there is a radical departure from representative democracy to participatory democracy. This participatory democracy is enshrined in the very concept of Gram Sabha, because every individual, irrespective of his birth, status, whether it is caste or economic status, can participate equally, raise his voice and contribute to decision making at the grassroots level. Imagine everyone contributing to decision making. That is what it means to be a participatory democracy. So from being a representative democracy to become a participatory democracy, we need something called Gram Sabha. Now if the Gram Sabha doesn't function and the Sarpanch takes the decision, definitely that is not collegiate functioning, it's not shared responsibility. Rather, we can say that the Sarpanch has colonized the entire decision making power. The Gram Sabha doesn't exist in practice. We have enough evidence, which we come across most often in the newspapers, where the Gram Sabha does not meet even the mandatory requirement of 2 meetings for every year, which means roughly 1 meeting for every 6 months. Because the Sarpanch either does not conduct a Gram Sabha meeting, or the people do not know that there exists something called Gram Sabha. Now we need to train both Gram Sabha as well as the Sarpanch in ensuring that the Panchayat functions as a Panchayat. The Panchayat literally means, in Sanskrit, it means a collegiate of five elders. Now here is a situation wherein only one elder is taking a decision. Of course he has a legitimacy because he is elected, but that is not what is the spirit of the constitution, because Gram Sabha is at the center. As it happens, the PRIs is designed in every state to be a collegiate process involving all the members of Panchayat at each level, and for decisions of the Panchayat to be taken in the plenary sessions of entire membership. Okay, the worst consequence of lack of adequate devolution and empowerment of people who are participating in Gram Sabha is the distortion of Panchayat Raj into something called the Sarpanch Raj. Now once Panchayat Raj becomes a Sarpanch Raj, the PRI is reduced to a nefarious nexus between the president of the Panchayat, who is nothing but the Sarpanch, whether it is at the village level or the intermediate level, which in some states is called Mandal or block, and the Jilla Parishad level. Okay, the nefarious nexus between the Panchayat president and the lower bureaucracy. This is certainly not democratic. Okay, so in other words, the point we are grappling here is that the devolution has not adequately followed the setting up of institutions. One. Second thing, empowerment of people who are participating in Gram Sabha, which means letting them know that they have some rights to participate in Gram Sabha and to take decisions, which is nothing but collective decision making. Since both of them have not followed, you have something called, in the place of Panchayat Raj, something called the Sarpanch Raj. Now this Sarpanch Raj has done something which is wonderful. What it has done is that it has decentralized corruption. In spite of decentralizing prosperity, we have decentralized corruption. Okay. This reminds us of the statement Aruna Roy made in 2002, when she says that the Sarpanch gets a honorarium of 400 rupees per month, but he spends lakhs to win the election. What logic explains this? This is not something new. So what Aruna Roy has been telling is something which is symptomatic of the larger malaise, which is nothing but decentralization of corruption. So unless this distortion is rectified as early as possible, people lose faith in Panchayat Raj. So Panchayat Raj will be equated, or in fact will be more feared than the parliament itself. This is certainly a dangerous trend for decentralization, for empowerment and for rural prosperity. Now it is important to ensure that genuine Panchayat Raj does not concentrate power. It is important to ensure that genuine Panchayat Raj does not concentrate power or decision making in the hands of very few, but rather it actively involves the whole of community. So that is the reason the absence of collegiate functioning has been the first and foremost rather important distortion which is created because of the half-baked reforms which were initiated in 1992. The second notable distortion is that almost every state, the second notable distortion is that the constitution envisages that there should be reservation of seats for Sarpanch, at the intermediate level, at the grassroots level, as well as the Jilla Parishad level. There is nothing wrong with that. We need it. We need people to participate. We need the vulnerable groups who are excluded from the power corridors to participate in democracy. That is what is meant by deepening of democracy. So including more and more groups in the decision making process, making sure that their voice is heard in the decision making, and ensuring that their interests are taken care as we go along, so that they are not left over in the process, are all equally important and laudable goals. So that is the reason the constitution makes it mandatory for reservation of certain number of seats for the vulnerable sections, especially scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. It goes on to say that women also should be reserved seats. It also asks the state governments to think about whether if there are any backward sections who have to be included in the process of democratic decision making. So many state governments have passed legislation to give reservation for OBCs. Now, the constitution also says that there has to be rotation of seats, because every individual should have the right to contest. So I should not be excluded from contesting because I belong to general category. So that is the reason we have to find a golden mean. The constitution says that the rotation of seats should be done on a term to term basis, which means that if in this term, if a particular constituency is reserved for scheduled caste, then next term it will not be reserved for scheduled caste but rather for scheduled tribe. Now remember, these groups are first time raising their voice. They are first time coming into visibility and participating in democratic process. So they are learning on job. Their crucial experience, which is gained for the first time, will be lost when the second time they do not have the adequate opportunity to contest even. And above that, the sarpanch or anyone who is elected does not have enough incentive to also do some good work, because any case that seat will not be reserved next year and he is not going to win. So it is almost ruled out that he is going to contest for the next term. When he is not going to contest, why should he go to the people to take the mandate? So in other words, the central point here is that rotation of reserved seats at every successive election results in little incentive for elected representatives to do a good job, because they will not mostly be able to stand again. So this has resulted in many first timers losing interest in doing some good job. And second thing, people also took it for granted. Many people took it for granted that in any case they will not be elected, so it doesn't matter whether they are adequately empowered or not. This is another distortion which is structural in nature. Now this can't be solved by anyone. So that is the reason this is considered to be one of the distortions of the half-baked reforms. Unless this is corrected at the earliest, many of our women representatives, which we talked about earlier, they are 12 lakh in number. Many of the women representatives whose first time experience in understanding public policy and implementing public policy is a very important crucial experience, because that is what is democracy. That will be lost. So that crucial loss is actually a social cost. Now unless this social cost is solved, is resolved, no furthering of deepening of democracy will actually be substantial in nature. Rather it will be ephemeral, it will be superficial. Such superficial lip service to something as crucial as participatory democracy certainly does not augur well for the effective functioning of PRI in the minds of the people. So people do not expect anything from PRI. So this has grave consequences. The third most important distortion is that decentralization in India is often criticized on the grounds of being only political decentralization and not enough in terms of administrative and fiscal devolution. Understand it in the broader context. We have talked about what the Prime Minister referred to as quote-unquote silent revolution. Now this silent revolution is nothing but deepening of democracy, more and more people participating in elections and then winning and then becoming visible in public policy, in public face, and also decision making as well as implementation of a host of programs. Now this is nothing but political empowerment. It is by no means less. But if it stops there, there is no use for the institution of Panchayat Raj, and Panchayat Raj becomes a celebration of elections. So, as Manishankar Iyer called it, the elections are festivals of democracy. But what is the use of festivals? Unless they mean something, unless they can do something substantial for the welfare of the people. So, elections, in other words, become a ritual. Once elections become a ritual and winning becomes a contest rather than a means to an end being public welfare and prosperity, then this is another serious consequence which must be taken care. So that is the reason decentralization in India for the past 2 decades has resulted in something called the silent revolution, but then lack of adequate administrative and fiscal devolution is a serious problem. And devolution of functionaries is lagging behind devolution of functions and funds in most of the states according to 2011 devolution index. So it means that devolution of functionaries, look at the case of lower bureaucracy, someone like the health official or the teacher who is attending the school which is in your neighborhood. Now all of these people should be under the panchayat or should be under the center. Well, the constitution says they must be under the panchayat. That is the spirit of the constitution, although the constitution is not so categorical. So, since this devolution did not take place, rather this devolution resulted in something called the silent revolution, which is actually not transforming itself into material benefits. These benefits have been only on the visibility side, right? More men and more women from vulnerable groups are coming into open space, contesting elections irrespective of caste barriers and religion barriers. But what is the material benefit these groups are getting? Is it translating itself into something tangible, which is measurable, which is quantifiable, or very broadly put it, is it something called inclusive governance? Or is it just a festival, like Manishankar Iyer called it? That is the key question. This is another distortion which is singularly the result of lack of stuffing of the institutions which were created in the first place. So the mandatory provisions were followed, but they are not stuffed adequately, they are not empowered adequately. So that is the reason we have a distortion called the decentralization of political empowerment, but rather not socio-economic empowerment. Now, unless this political democracy is transformed into socio-economic democracy, there is no substantial improvement for the people, and everything will be a paper tiger. The fourth key distortion is what is called in popular literature as elite capture. Elite capture is nothing but the dominance of elite groups over decision making and financial resources. Now, scholars like Griffith have pointed out that power at the local level, and I quote, is more concentrated, more elitist, and is applied more ruthlessly against the poor. In other words, Griffith is suggesting that power at the local level is very dangerous. If that is the case, why do you need to decentralize power? So the answer is that decentralization of power has to go concomitantly with empowerment of people, so that people demand accountability from the one who is holding that power. So the power holder must be made accountable to the people. That is the thumb rule of democracy. Now, if the people are not adequately empowered, this elite capture is a sine qua non. In other words, the benefits of decentralized socio-economic programs would be captured by the local elite, which in turn would result in underinvestment in public goods and services for the poor. So those things, those policies which benefit the poor will not be taken care. So decentralization does not do any good for the people at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, unless these people are taken care, this participative democracy or the festivals of democracy do not mean anything to them, and they will remain excluded, and that is not inclusive governance or inclusive growth. Having said that, we must understand that there is enough empirical evidence indicating that decentralization increases corruption and reduces accountability. When does this happen? So we can say that scholarly research suggests that the extent of capture of local governments by local elites depends on at least 4 factors. These 4 factors have to be carefully observed and guarded against. The first one is if the level of social and economic inequality within the communities The Administrative Reforms Commission, the second Administrative Reforms Commission, in its fourth report, Ethics and Governance, talks about corruption in depth, wherein it says that ultimately the concept of corruption has to be dealt socially, because corruption is a social problem. So technological fixes do not solve the problem of corruption. You might have something called the GPS system which monitors the movement of trucks of PDS in Chhattisgarh. But who actually observes the GPS? It is again people. So who polices the police? Who judges the judge? These are classic questions in public administration. So unless this issue is dealt socially, you cannot have a long-lasting answer to corruption. Today we have a situation wherein corruption is something which is taken for granted, because many people think that the corruption of 10 rupees is much less than 1.76 lakh in 2G scam. So this 10 rupees corruption is not wrong. So this perception, which is psychological as much as social, is certainly degrading the very moral fabric of the society. Now where does this come from? Many scholars and sociologists primarily argue that is primarily because of the social and economic inequality existing within the communities. Look at this picture. If some communities are much less deprived than some other communities, now there will be a lot of information asymmetry between these two communities. So it naturally follows that these communities cannot know adequately what the other communities know. So that is the reason these communities continue to be corrupt, whereas these communities cannot make them answerable for their corruption. So there will not be any clear call for accountability, for bringing those who are corrupt to the book. So social and economic inequality is the ultimate answer, socially speaking, to corruption. So that is one of the reasons for local elite capture. The second reason is that if there is a tradition of political participation and awareness in the people, the chances of elite capture of the public institution are very less, because local awareness increases the chance that elites are observed, are vigilant. Mahatma Gandhi rightly remarked that the price of democracy is eternal vigilance. So it is the duty of the citizen to be vigilant always, to see that democracy is democracy. So the key point here is that awareness of individuals, which in this context is nothing but Gram Sabha, is very important. The third thing is transparency in local decision making process. If the decision making process is transparent, the chances of elite capture are very least. So that is the reason tools like Right to Information Act and tools like technology actually help in ensuring that elite capture of public institutions is least. Apart from that, it is the media which holds the government accountable to the people for good governance. So media's interest in local panchayat elections is equally important.